Hello and welcome to Vivowire, the podcast from Workvivo by Zoom, where we explore the ideas, leadership habits, and cultural shifts shaping the modern world of work. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Bruce Daisley. Bruce is a best-selling author and tech leader from the UK, widely regarded as one of the most respected thought leaders on workplace culture. He's the author of The Joy of Work, Fortitude, and Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat, which also happens to be the name of his wildly popular podcast and newsletter. Check those out. Bruce is known for translating behavioral science into action with small habits that actually make work better. So, from rethinking burnout to proving that friendship and belonging drive performance, not the other way around, Bruce's work challenges us to design work more intentionally. We like to just dive right into things here at VivaWire, so I've got a nice, juicy one for you. Uh, Looking back over your career, Bruce, was there a specific moment that kind of fundamentally changed the way you think about work and workplace culture?
Yeah, I worked in technology companies for a long time. I worked at Google, I worked at Twitter under the previous owners. But prior to that, I worked in old media, in magazines and radio. And there was a moment in time when I first started my career where I was uh, really intrigued. We were against a competitive organization, another magazine company. And one of the things that was notable was that their company was obsessed with profits. And our company seemed to be obsessed with culture, or certainly put culture first. And it did it in a number of ways. It gave a lot of autonomy to teams, it gave a lot of autonomy to workers. It really focused a sense of cohesion amongst everyone who worked there. But the interesting thing for me was that even though our competitors' goal was profit and success, we were more profitable, we were faster growing, and we achieved more. And it just really struck me. It was like one of those rare A/B tests out in the wild where actually you could see that a company that maybe didn't value its people as much ended up being less effective, less successful than they expected to be. And I've always had a fascination, a curiosity for culture ever since, especially with the nuance of what can culture achieve? Can it make teams more creative? Can it make teams more inventive? Can it make teams more resilient? I've just been sort of obsessed and fascinated with those things from a practical point of view, really.
So, what did tech teach you specifically about culture and how organizations really function? Because I'm sure you had some big learnings working for, you know, for Google. I mean, that's like pretty
That's right.
outstanding.
That's right. When I went to work at Google, I was definitely curious. I was definitely. I think a lot of people who don't work in technology companies presume that they are somehow wired different or built on different infrastructure, and we were, you know, ready to have an awakening, a realization that everything we'd done until now was out of date and dusty. And actually, what I realized pretty quickly at Google that wasn't the case. But in fact, far more was in common than I anticipated. I don't think they had the answers on culture. I don't think they'd resolved motivation. I don't think they'd created a version of work that was any more effective. And so it became a wake up call for me actually. When I went to Twitter, my feeling was, okay, well, if I've recognized that tech firms in themselves cannot claim to have a monopoly on culture, this is a much smaller enterprise. Can I play a part in creating something special here? When I joined Twitter, it was about 400 people. We were far more able to have an impact on doing things. And so it was a delightful experience in seeing if we could build a culture from the ground up, really. So yeah, uh, starting with the sort of the qualifier that tech firms don't really have either a monopoly or even an advantage when it comes to culture compared to everyone else. I think, it sort of helped me realize, okay, culture can be it and is always a sort of participative sport that people need to feel like they're involved to have an impact on it.
I mean, what an incredible opportunity to use your words, build a culture sort of from the ground up. Like, I'm sure there were so many learnings coming out of that. I know a lot of your work is really backed by research and behavioral science, and I think that's what makes it so special. Uh, was there, especially when you're working on joy of work, any particular research that you came across, in your time kind of putting that together that really genuinely surprised you?
My fascination came from we'd had a sensational culture that had really been energized. Then, in a pattern that's quite familiar with firms right now, we'd had to do one round of job cuts, and then 12 months later, another round of job cuts. And my curiosity as a leader was, can we get the party popping again? Can we bring some of the energy back to the way that the team's working? Can we bring that magical sense of motivation back, or is it just gone forever now? Is it just something that we've lost to the unfortunate experience of time? Because once you've done a job cut, psychological safety has been damaged and you can't get it back. And that was entirely my start point as a manager, as a leader. I was just thinking, what can we do to get the culture going again? And so that became my obsession, really. And psychological safety actually is an interesting place to start, because it's a lot has been written about psychological safety, about how to build it, but it remains one of the sort of enigmatic um, traits. It remains something that I don't think anyone has ever pinpointed precisely what actions will bring you psychological safety. It's very easy to describe what destroys it, but it's quite difficult um, to sort of write a playbook of how to build psychological safety. So that became a an obsession, really. Can we do anything to get the team back to the motivation that we had before? I subscribe very firmly to the idea that actually, to understand how to build psychological safety, it's very closely aligned with social identity, with a sense of we-ness, group identity, that we feel like us, that we feel like we're a cohesive group. And so the reason why psychological safety gets damaged when you've got a reduction in force, when you've got job cuts, redundancies, whatever you describe it as, is because there feels like there's been a schism. There's been sort of this split that separates the leaders from the workers, that no longer is trust there, no longer is there a sense of safety there, no longer a sense that we can speak candidly to each other without consequence. Consequence has just presented itself very evidently as one of the dangers. And my feeling is that anything that can build a cohesive sense of we-ness, of group identity, is what serves to forge psychological safety. And look, and that might be, it's just the people in this office feel a sense of collective identity, or it might be just the people in this department feel it. But the more that you can build that, and the more that people believe that there's a candor that runs through that department, I think psychological safety comes from that. So my view would be, there are several things that help remove a sense of collective identity, remove a sense of we-ness. One of the things actually I loved in the Workvivo research that you published last year is you said 87% of frontline workers don't believe the company culture applies to them. I think about that all the time, because it's such a vivid, well, it's such a big number, but I think all of us could visualize exactly the circumstances where a message might be coming from head office or from the leadership team, and the people on the front line might think, I'm surrounded with friends here. I love all these people I work with, and yet I don't feel that the big bosses understand their job. And, it's a really sort of valuable reminder, I think, of how there can be a split. I love watching people in restaurants, people in retail stores, people when you're either checking in at an airline or on an airline, watching how those people interact, frontline workers. And quite often you can see them overwhelmed because they see that the set of rules that have been given to check you in with, or to the sort of police your experience with, they don't agree with the rules, but there's nothing they can do about them. You say, is there any chance I could do this? They say, I'm not allowed to allow you to do it. And you realize in those situations, the people on the front line, if it was up to them, they would do something differently, if they had the autonomy. And it's a sign that there's a schism between how the leadership feel and how the team feel. The more you can make it feel like the team feel like they've got a say in how the organization is run, I think the more social, the more psychological safety you have, in my perspective.
I also am really enjoying your use of the term "we-ness." I think that's, something like we definitely at Workvivo believe in, this sense of belonging. It is so critical to a positive employee experience overall, and I know in some of your work you talk about the importance of friendship, and I'm sure, like, observing some of these retail workers or in hospitality, I feel like so many times you hear, like, "It feels like a family," right? So they have this really strong sense of connection in some of these really positive work environments. So, why do you think friendship in particular, and thinking about your work wife, your work bestie, why is that so central to performance and happiness at work?
Yeah, well, look, the importance of friends at work, I think, is one of the enduring data points that most of us who study this stuff are fixated on. And it's a fascinating one because it immediately produces a point of friction that if you go into a C-suite meeting and you say, one of the biggest predictors of engagement at work is having a friend at work, it feels so trivial that it doesn't justify standing up in front of a senior boardroom team and saying it. It feels embarrassingly sort of playground. And so, but nevertheless, it proves to be such a big predictor of how engaged we are with our jobs. I just think it's an important reminder of how most um, most connection starts with the emotional rather than the rational. If we feel like we've got someone at work who understands us, if we feel like we are seen, the way I always think about workplace culture, I think of a really simple three-stage model. I think the first part of any sort of relationship, but in particular a workplace relationship, is a sense of mattering, feeling like I feel significant to the people I work with, feeling like my work is significant. So mattering starts. The second part is this we-ness. I don't think we-ness can have an impact unless we personally feel that we are respected. And so unless you've done the mattering part, the we-ness doesn't hold. In fact, you might find that the organization feels cliquey and you feel like an outsider to it unless you feel respected in your own way. So mattering, then we-ness. And the final part is just the consequence of all of that. When people feel that their work has been noticed, when they feel that they are part of something significant, you can activate a sense of autonomy in workers and make them feel empowered to get work done. And that's the magic of a good culture. So when you go into organizations and you see, they've got a culture that's performing really well, it's got each of those components, where the third part is where you get that exponential benefit, where you get workers who are going over and above the call and duty, that where they're doing remarkable work. Um, we often hear examples of firms where the workers have sort of taken initiative to try and make customers happier, and that's all because of those three ingredients have worked in accord with each other, really. So, that's what I'd sort of say there. It's trying to make sure that all of those components play a part in building a good culture.
I think, it's interesting to hear the perspective of, like, calling this out to your C-suite, right? In the kind of more simpler terms of kind of having a friend at work and things like that. I feel like it's almost more telling of, like, our leaders kinda lacking some emotional intelligence. I think a lot of your work, I feel like, is really rooted in emotional intelligence as well and how critical that is. Do you think that leaders are just kinda underestimating the emotional side of work?
If we look into the evidence of this, the evidence suggests that we're far more likely to quit over workplace culture than we will over salary, that we're far more likely to quit because either that we feel like we've got a toxic relationship with our boss or we think that the culture is toxic. I think, the data I've seen on that is that we're 10 times more likely to quit for those reasons. And when you've witnessed that firsthand, when you've sat down with people and done an exit interview and they tell you they're quitting because of the culture, what you very quickly realize is that when someone quits because of culture, by the time that it takes them to resign, they've spent 5 or 6 sleepless Sunday nights thinking, "I can't do this. I can't go there." And, emotion is so indelibly linked in that experience that they might feel some degree of dissonance. The thing I've witnessed in some of the organizations I've worked in is that people believe, well, rationally, this is a great job. But everyone I meet tells me how lucky I am to work at dot, dot, dot. You know, but why am I so unhappy? And you can see them sort of battling out this sort of right brain, left brain thing of the rational part of me tells me that I should be here. I should, try and see this out, spend a few years here. It'll be good for me, it'll be good for my resume. And then the emotional part of me is I'm hating every single minute I'm doing this. And, uh, like at heart, most decisions I believe are emotional, and we might apply a sort of rational skin to them. And so when employers don't necessarily think about the human experience, they're missing the fact that ultimately a lot of their employees will make a move and move on.
Another piece is, like, I feel like burnout, like, thinking about ho to me, burnout feels like it's just sort of rampant right now, and, like, that's obviously more of, like, a symptom, not a root cause, and, like, thinking about hustle culture, that's, like, something that I know sort of in your work you really reject, and, like, grinding, working ourselves into the ground ultimately is gonna reduce productivity, creativity, all these things. How do we, really shift the way we design work?
Yeah, I think quite often a lot of us find ourselves in a state of learned helplessness when it comes to the way that we work. And I'll give you a specific example. I did some work with a pharma company, a big pharmaceutical company, and as part of an exercise, I was doing two things. I was doing a keynote and I was running a workshop on burnout. And the workshop on burnout, I thought I'd start off by addressing the audience, and I said to them, can anyone tell me who spends more than 20 hours a week in meetings? And they all put their hands up. And I said that anyone over 25, someone stopped me and said, I'm going to stop you there. We all here spend at least 40 hours a week in meetings. I was like, okay, right. We've identified the cause of the burnout. Right. Let's move from here. Let's start talking about the ways that we can reduce that. And she said, I'm going to stop you there. We're not going to do any less meetings, any fewer meetings. It's like, okay, that's interesting. And so I sort of try, I mean, disastrous to be
I
running
was gonna
a
say, you're
session
just
on
like,
burnout.
workshop over.
I
Guess this is
know.
where
What'd
we
you
end.
do? So it's like, okay, we've got 90 minutes to roll here. Like, let me try and work out. And so I started sort of to try and have a debate about what are the reasons why we couldn't do that. And I had in the room, I had the person who was running Latin America and the person who was running Europe and the Middle East. Okay, so so one step from the CEO of the company in regional areas, and neither of these people believed that they could have an impact on reducing the amount of time we spend in meetings. Really interesting that you got people who are right in the C-suite, they're at the board level, and yet they don't believe that they could reduce the amount of time we spend in meetings. And it just poses this really interesting question that if your work is almost preordained before you take your job, before you stamp your own signature on it, what do we believe that the manager's there for? What is the leader there for if work is already laid out that we're going to be in back-to-back meetings a week? And it poses this really interesting question. The one thing we know from competition is that quite often you want to try and find the way to do what your competitors aren't doing, to behave in a way that isn't just following the predictable routines of your competitors. And yet almost every organization, you might move from company to company, almost every organization starts with a very similar grid of 25 to 30 hours a week of meetings in the calendar, people very frequently doing things. I think 85% of people admit to doing other things while in meetings, and you'd almost be failing in your job to not multitask. How on earth would you get your job done? And so it poses really interesting questions. If leaders don't perceive that they've got the agency to change that, and that's preordained, and it poses really big questions. So for me, anytime I'm thinking about how can we make work better, the decisions often are quite simple about how can we reduce the amount of time commitments that people have got. So if you're trying to resolve burnout, the first thing that, I had this situation in somewhere I was working. We had a lot of the people, we had a high quit rate. And when we chatted to the people who were quitting, they said, I feel overwhelmed. I'm dreaming about work. I can't get anything done. And so the senior leaders at the organization said, no one's quitting from our competitors like this. That people aren't quitting with no job to go to from there. So we decided we're going to do something about it. And the way we set about doing it was reducing the amount of time people spend in meetings and secondly, reducing weekend emails, weekend Slacks, and just reduce weekend communication. Now, we didn't we probably set ourselves the goal of halving the amount of time in meetings, and we probably lowered it by 40% rather than halving it. But it had a really big impact on the motivation of team members. It had a really big impact, I think, in people believing that their jobs could be better again. And so, for me, any intervention, the best thing you can do is starting by thinking of short-term exercises that reduce the calendar pressure on people. So that might be saying the first week of April is a meeting-free week. Really simple. It's like low cost of entry. It's a one-off week. It's kind of no one's ways of working are massively altered by, or a week in the summer that you do that. But by making just short-term experiments, you give people the opportunity to demonstrate, oh, actually, there was a real benefit to that. Yeah, I really felt energized by that way of working. Actually, the ability to pull up a chair at someone's desk and just talk through ideas at their computer seemed to be way more effective than having a scheduled meeting. And it just gives people a glimpse of how you could do things differently. So I love experiments and interventions like that. There is some benefit in having a meeting-free day on the day that you're coordinated in the office. And so, if you do have 2 or 3 office days a week or whatever you've got, trying to have a meeting-free day or experiment with having a meeting-free day on one of those days also proves to be an interesting experiment to try out, because you do get some of those accidental collisions, people having a coffee with each other, or, heading out to lunch together and sitting outside, and you do encounter things that maybe we've slightly lost a little bit from the busy week.
Yeah, well, I think even myself, the days I go into the office, most of us are sort of scattered in phone booths
Yeah.
taking calls, and then you're really missing out on the value of having time in person. Although, for me, I feel like it's good for my own sanity to get out, to be with people. And then, yeah, you have those great, just organic conversations, running into someone, you overhear a conversation, can jump in, and you miss a lot of that like spontaneity when you're kind of you're at home at your computer. You miss a lot of those conversations, which can become great
100%.
opportunities and ideas and innovations. Um, I have to touch on very, I feel like ever the hot topic. I'm thinking specifically about AI and sort of the future of work. And I feel like a lot of times when we're talking about AI, we're thinking about productivity. And, how can we kind of relieve ourselves of certain, maybe more mundane, basic tasks. But what about in the culture of, or in the context of company culture? Is there a way, or like, how do you see AI maybe potentially improving company culture?
Yeah, there's a really interesting moment going on, I think, with AI right now. I attended several AI events sort of back end of last year, and on stage, a lot of organizations talking about what their AI products were, the implementations they were making available. But what was interesting for me is all of the conversations I had with attendees at that event. They said to me, My company's doing nothing on AI. I'm just here because I don't want to be left behind." And I was kind of dazzled by that, because I think most of us in our personal life have experimented a little bit with throwing things at AI, whether it's recipes or personal tasks that we've got, or planning vacations for us, and we've seen dazzling results. And so, because all of us have sort of experimented around with this, to witness so few organizations having plans for it was really stark for me. I think what we've also got, though, is a dissonance where increasingly the C-suite are talking about, we need AI plans and we're needing to do things. And it feels to me, as a result, a lot of this AI intervention that we're seeing is going to be top down and might not necessarily have buy-in from the workforce. So I think, there's an interesting 12 months really that we're in right now, where it seems like the most effective AI is going to be, to some extent, bottom up and organically led by teams, like everything to do with culture, really. Things that might fail or when they're top down and just imposed upon people. It's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, 100%. So we're going to switch gears to a little rapid fire round. So we do a little thing called culture myth busting here. So I am going to throw a few kind of common workplace statements, myths, what have you. And I want you to tell me whether or not you agree or not, and why. So we're going to fire away. Hybrid work destroys company culture.
I disagree with that. So my perspective is that some degree of face-to-face time has got an immense value to it. But, we've known for a long time that that could be for our families, that could be that we get together with them at Christmas or Thanksgiving or religious times or some sort of reunion, and one and done can bring us back up to speed. Um, I do think with teams, possibly you need a little bit more than that, sort of between a day a week or 2 days a week, 3 days a week seems to be a good balance based on the size of the team. But I don't believe hybrid work by its very nature, or even remote work in itself, destroys culture. It's about making the effort to build that cohesion, really.
Yeah, being a lot more intentional with the design. All right, another one for you. People care more about flexibility than belonging.
Look, I think this comes down to an individual versus collective approach to life. And look, there's no doubt that in the course of the last 20 years that we've become more fixated on individualism and doing what's right for us. There's an old adage, which is inconvenience is the cost of community. And, if you want to build community, then you need to suck up some things that you don't want. So I'll give you a perfect example. Cooking a meal, it's really easy to cook the meal that you want. If you want to cook for and host some friends, you're probably not going to be able to cook the first thing that comes into your mind. You might have to take someone's dietary requirements into account, or take into account, they can't eat some things or they prefer some things. But the inconvenience gives you a much better outcome. And that sense of feeling part of something, that sense of feeling connected to others, that sense of just the joy of sharing something, that comes with a slight cost of inconvenience. And so, my philosophy overall is there is a trade off. You can go down a route of total individualism. Work can, as a result, feel quite lonely. You could choose to live it that way. You could live and say, your work colleagues aren't important to you. You're spending 40 hours a week doing something where having relationships with people isn't important. There's definitely an individualistic solution there. But I think what we do know is that both for our own health and our happiness, connection to others seems to be one of the biggest providers of that sense of meaning from work.
All right, so we do like to give our listeners kind of little tangible takeaways from the conversations here at Vivowire. So you've written a lot about the power of just small rituals, right? So the joy of work has 30 ways to fall in love with your job again, which I love that. So if listeners could borrow kind of one or two practices from that, and thinking about improving their company culture, ways to boost connection, what would you like to share?
Yeah, for me, rituals of connection are so powerful. I saw a wonderful one where this one team in the UK, they refer to potatoes as spuds. Okay, so you have to bear with
That
me here.
translates.
It's yeah, it's a sort of it's a anyway. But this one team told me that they were in work every Monday. They had to be in the office on Mondays. And so this team, they were a finance team, I believe. And so every Monday they created Spud Club, where they would just someone each week would bring in 10 potatoes. They would make jacket potatoes, and they would take it in turns to provide the potatoes and to provide the fillings. Now, very superficial. The reason why they said they enjoyed it is they said it was a really low cost way for them all to eat together every Monday. So like very, very scalable, very sort of easy to reproduce. But they said it kind of became our identity, that we'd all use it as an excited opportunity to catch up on what missed over the weekend, or to hear about the next installment of what happened last week in someone's dating experience or family experience. And it was an organic thing. But it became this ritual of connection. And so this team, built this really wonderful sense of cohesion in this low cost way. We quite often hear about firms providing free food. This organization had no opportunity to have free food, but they'd created their own version of it. Now, whether that is the perfect version for anyone, but I think these really interesting pointers in what's right about that. And that ritual that generally the rituals of any group, whether it's a family, it's an organization, the rituals that we give time to normally signal what matters to us. And so, you know, rituals of connection I absolutely love, and they can take many different forms. But if you've got one that seems like it's got a bit of life to it, then, giving it some time, some funding, some resource can be a great way to try to make it feel like the culture's developed something organic that feels ownable to that office. So I love things like that. Rituals of connection are a really important area of fascination for me, really.
And I think, there's something my background's in food, but I'm just a huge believer in, like, the power of I think food and ritual are kinda just, like, inherently intertwined, right? Like, you think about culture, like, just more broadly of different cultures all around the world of how central food is and how wonderful it is at bringing people together, whether it's, potatoes or, we used to do my previous workplace, we were in New York City, Bagel Friday was everybody looked forward to Bagel Friday, and nobody missed a Bagel Friday. Um, so I always ask my guests here, little future thinking. So what's giving you hope right now about the future of work?
For me, we're in a really interesting moment. Microsoft published a report last year called the Work Trends Index. And the Work Trends Index, I think for the first time, sort of laid out what has become our fixation and fascination ever since. The idea that, we are entering an era where before we ask a colleague how to do something, we might ask AI how to do it. Before we pick someone's brain on a marketing plan or a sales plan or a communication plan for next quarter, we might ask AI to do it first. And, and to think about the second order consequence of that is a really important step because, you know, most of us work in competitive environments. We've got another firm or five other firms doing what we're doing. And it, if everyone's instinct is to go to the intelligence that's on tap, it begs the question, what's the difference between what we're doing and what our competitors are doing? Because if, there's five firms side by side, and when they're thinking about their content plan or their marketing plan for next quarter, they all ask this super intelligence, then we're highly likely to end up with something that is identical in each of these places. And what you realize very quickly is the differentiator is the human layer. The differentiator is what we bring on top. And we possibly need to be a degree more intentional about that, but also we need to really assert what that layer is going to bring for us. And so for me, the last remaining differentiator for business going forwards is culture. The choices we make, the decisions we make, and quite often you can witness culture. If you go into a retail store and you say to them, "Where are the breakfast cereals?" And whether they stop what they're doing and walk you to the breakfast cereals, or they point and they say it's the third aisle down there, that's a cultural decision. Culture is the organizational programming that they decide what their approach is. So you can witness culture in the world. And we don't always witness that in our organizations. But going forwards, that differentiator of what decisions we make are going to be more and more important. So we might say it's going to be really important for us to have a wonderful tone of voice to what we do, or it's going to be really important for our business that we have the best customer service. If something goes wrong, Apple's a good example of this. If something goes wrong, it's not just about the products. If something goes wrong, a human is going to help you, right? It's an often neglected aspect to the Apple brand, but you can witness in different places their perspective is at variance. And I think going forwards, that human element, that cultural element is going to play a bigger and bigger part in how we really sort of differentiate our firm. So that's what I'm optimistic about. I think we're going to enter into an era where the firms who care about culture, the firms who say this is going to be our point of difference, are really going to demonstrate why they are more in tune with what we want than their rivals and competitors.
Sounds like we've got a lot to be optimistic about, I think. So, It's come time for a shameless plug for you, Bruce. We've got to say, you've got to be sure to grab one of Bruce's books. Check out his podcast and newsletter, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. Bruce, how else can people learn about you and your work?
Yeah, I mean, most of the stuff you'll find on my website, which is you'll find at eatsleepworkrepeat.com. And like you say, there's a newsletter. It goes to about 150,000 people, and you know, it's a very just a straightforward take on what's happening in the world of work culture, what we're learning, what goes well, what goes badly, and you know, what any of us can do, whether we're the big boss or whether we're just aspiring to have more input in our own teams. What can any of us do to make our workplaces better?
I love that. So, thank you so much for the thoughtful conversation today. Your work really reminds me that better culture isn't about like the big plays and the flashy statements. It's about those small rituals. It's the research backed changes that we can make to really improve connection, happiness, resilience, and trust over time. So, to everybody listening, if something sparked for you today, share it with others. Keep that conversation going. Be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Barbara Boris. This is Vivo Wire, and we'll see you next time.